Well, thanks for coming out, everyone. I wanted to mention real briefly that when Dr. McCauley and I were first designing this philosophy minor, which is now 5 years old, 6?
5.
We imagined philosophy intersections in which student work would be featured, and particularly a panel of students sort of interacting and sharing different angles on the same question. And I'm really excited about tonight. I don't know why it took us 5 years, but we're both very excited about this idea. And we thank all of you for piloting it with us, the idea of student work being the center of the intersections of philosophy. Before I introduce the panelists, I just want to make a couple brief comments about the class you're going to hear about. It's Philosophy 335, Ethics. And I often start the ethics course with a distinction between ethics and morals. And morals are often the sort of claims we make. And our morals come from religion, cultural tradition, historical traditions from society. And there are often claims about right and wrong. There are often claims about good and evil. There are often claims about the good life. And ethics is a philosophical field that's not necessarily in the business of making those claims, but it's in the business of analyzing moral claims about right and wrong, about the good life. And so what ethics does is it tries to utilize the philosophical tools of rationalism and empiricism to sort of find ways of knowing, find epistemologies of knowing what is the good life. And one of the distinctions that ethics makes is a distinction between can and ought. Right? We can do a lot of things as a species, but ought we to do all of them, or any of them, right? I'm not a physicist, but I often use the example of when you look at an atomic bomb when it goes off. On the level of physics, we've basically created a star in that moment. We're a tremendous species. We can create a star. But ought we to have dropped that on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is a much more difficult human question than whether or not we can create a star. And therefore, ethics is very much a field of epistemology as well as an analysis of moral claims. What you're going to hear about tonight is a series of community service projects that we called the Praxis Project. And the reason this emerged was that through, I think, 5 years of teaching the ethics course, I felt something missing, and some of my leading students felt like something was missing from that analysis of how one ought to live. And that was actual living, right? And one of the things we found was that what ethics tries to challenge is the idea that good for me is not the only measurement of good. In fact, it's quite a dangerous measurement of good when you're thinking about the common good, or what's good for humanity, or what's good for the environment, or what's good for other societies, or even other human beings. Right? Good for me has not historically been our most reliable measurement of good in itself. And so what are some other measurements we have, some other ways of thinking about how do we know how we ought to live? And you can use the different tools of rationalism. We look at philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who use the tools of rationality to think about how we know whether an action is right or wrong before it even happens. It's a thing called the categorical imperative, where he says we can rationalize whether an action before it happens is going to treat another person as a thing, whether another person needs to be reduced to a thing in order for us to live the lives that we want. We can know before we even act through rationality. We look at empirical perspectives, utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who want to measure through the consequences of our actions, whether or not those actions brought about the greatest good for the greatest number of people for the longest time. But even when you combine rationalism and empiricism as ways of knowing good beyond just good for me, there's still something missing. And what that is to actually be stretched beyond good for me, to be stretched outside of the daily comforts of your life, to be unsettled a little bit, and to share and partner with other people in the community trying to reach beyond good for me. And so that's what we've done. Brian Goldstein and Ian Oster were former students of mine in the ethics class from previous years, and they had the same question. They had the same concern that the course was not stretching enough beyond the sort of theoretical and academic, was not asking people to experience and apply these theories, to practice these theories, to complicate these theories through seeing how the community negotiates these questions of how we ought to live. And as a result, Brian and Ian, after taking the ethics class, I asked them to do an independent study on a theoretical framework known as praxis, which is the combination of theory and action, which is what it means to sort of practice and to put into practice the ideas explored in philosophy. And after that independent study, and you're going to hear from them about that independent study tonight, they then became, the following semester, my work study students who were teaching assistants who worked with community leaders to create a series of service learning projects and to work with students in the class to design their own praxis projects and to add to the ethics curriculum, to complicate the ethics curriculum with a series of readings about praxis. And so what you're going to see tonight is a sort of series of stories about that experiment we did in the ethics course. So Brian Goldstein's an environmental studies major. He was one of the teaching assistants. Ian Oster's another environmental studies major who also partnered with Brian in assisting me in adding a praxis component. Samuel Johnson is an alumnus of Western State College, a history major, who's come back from retirement. Right? Hipster's going to retire at 23. So he's come back from retirement to join us on this panel to talk about a project he did for the class working with the Gunnison Trails Association. Lindsay Olander, she worked with the Justin Healers, and she'll talk about that and her sort of life in rodeo and how that influenced her Praxis project and her own ethical lens. And Ricky Boucher, who did a whole number of projects. Ricky's a poli-sci major, and by the way, Lindsay's a business major. Ricky's a poli-sci major who put together a series of projects ranging from president of the Political Science Club to leading the sex-positive group on campus to organizing a series of panels on the Occupy Wall Street protests. And so what you're going to hear are these stories, and I want to leave most of the hour to them, so let's welcome them.
Thanks everybody for coming. We're excited to be here, and I'm glad you guys are too. It's funny, you hear Dr. John speak, and then you're like, oh, you just gave me an idea. Maybe I should change that around. But what this is, this whole project spanning, I think, the course of a couple of years at this point, from when we started ethics to this, it's kind of a cool journey to see. So I just wanted to kind of give some background on why we believe that action is urgent in our time. And so some basic statistics that kind of help frame the conversation on why we feel so motivated to act. If you look on an environmental level, we see biodiversity loss at 1,000 to 10,000 times normal background rate extinction. We are in the middle of a mass extinction. On an economic level, we see that an average CEO makes 400 times the average worker's wage. Almost half the world, over 3 billion people, live on less than $2.50 a day. More than 80% of the world's population live in countries where income differentials are widening. Some 1.1 billion in developing countries have inadequate access to water, and 2.6 billion lack basic sanitation. On more of a national level, you hear about this political efficacy that we have, the right to vote, that we celebrate so strongly in America. And when you look at voter turnout, that tool to make that action happen the way you want to see it happen, we have 38% turnouts in non-presidential elections on a federal level, and about 50 when we do have a president. And the startling fact is that those numbers are declining since the 60s. And so we have less, I guess, citizen efficacy, if you want to turn it like that. And so we're kind of sitting at a point where, okay, well, what do we do? And so Dr. John kind of explained to you our story. And through that independent study, we came up with these 6 tenets of praxis, kind of 6 themes. And I kind of want to reiterate that these are our subjective interpretation. Praxis is really what you want it to be. But the fundamentals, we saw these 6 themes going through. So I'll start with the first 3. And I think the best place to start is with the organic intellectual. This term really encompasses a ground-up approach to action and in philosophy in general. So the organic intellectual has universal accessibility, and Gramsci, in kind of a complex quote, stay with me, he says, each man carries on some form of intellectual activity, that he is a philosopher, an artist, a man of taste. He participates in a particular conception of the world, has a conscious line of moral conduct, and therefore contributes to sustain a conception of a world, to modify it, that is, to bring into new being modes of thought. And so I think the most important part of that to remember is that everyone is a philosopher, and you don't really have a choice one way or the other, and that this is the universal accessibility that we're talking as a fundamental of praxis. This includes agency and the ability to analyze banal acts within your society that might seem natural when you were raised, kind of instinctual almost, but then you come to see as that organic intellectual that these things are really a product of our society. They're social, they're cultural. On top of that awareness, we see the organic intellectual understanding a sense of history. And Gramsci coined this term as historicity. And it really is what it sounds like. The most basic quote we can to sum that up is that philosophy cannot be separated from the history of philosophy, nor can culture from the history of culture. And so history is essentially a modern interpretation of past praxis. History is what we view of their theory and action coming in light of that. And the organic intellectual realizes that we live within these contexts. We can't escape it. And so there's a mindfulness and awareness of that history that Gramsci coined historicity. It gives us a sense of belonging, and kind of the most dramatic example of that, in our ethics class, we read from Elie Wiesel, who, if you've ever heard of Night, it's really just it's an astounding account of a Holocaust survivor. And he has a quote from that says, "The same smoke floats over all our heads." And that's pretty graphic, but you can think of historicity in that sense, that we are all part of this historical context, and you can't found that in a natural argument. These are not the way things are. This time that we live in is a product of historical events culminating up to that point. Moving along, we see the term hegemony coined by Gramsci as well, and this is kind of that current understanding of historicity. Is like, what is your cultural context of today? And we see hegemony as the dominating social opinion in society. You can see this as the American dream on a kind of a broader scale. It's liberalism in general. You see after the 1700s, this idea of liberalism, spreading throughout all of the western part of the globe. And the tenets of that were really freedom and capitalism. And that was hegemony. Those aren't naturally based arguments. These are things that were argued for and brought about. And so that puts us in a current cultural context that we need to be aware of. So the organic intellectual, analyzing his history, realizing his hegemony, starts to form this basic outline of the praxis construct. And so this gives us kind of the realm to work within, the space that we need to be aware and to work within to see the social change that we want to bring about. And so some key points to this historicity and hegemony. Gramsci lays out that says, 1, language itself, which is a totality of determined notions and concepts, not just of words grammatically devoid of content. 2 is common sense and good sense. 3 is popular religion, and therefore also an entire system of beliefs, superstitions, opinion, ways of seeing things, and action, which are collectively bundled together under the name of folklore. You could kind of say that's hegemony in general. And so this is kind of like an awareness coming about. I think a lot of people kind of come to these conclusions when they reach this kind of epiphany age of academic understanding. You realize that the systems that are in place are not just naturally based, but they're absolutely societally based. And for us, that was kind of an alarming thing. You don't see the equity gap anymore as just kind of a, us and them, but more of a giant question mark with an exclamation right after it of why these things are the way they are. And that challenges us to not just question, analyze, and understand these things, but to push these things to turn a different light. And so when you're realizing that you're creating this historicity, this hegemony, as an organic intellectual, that's what gives kind of...
So with the conceptualizations of hegemony and the fact that you are born into a reality in which everything is rational, you're given free will. The conduct of an individual is framed by personal choice. It's not determined by physical or divine forces of fatalistic characters. And with free will, one of the main conceptions of praxis allows people to look at the life with perception of their own choosing. They're allowed to analyze their own life and fulfill their own values with whatever actions they decide to do. Now, given that, obviously there's not infinite free will. I cannot turn into a hippopotamus and fly out of this room currently. So, there's cultural and there's personal experiences that limit free will. Essentially, you're raised with a background ideology that makes your own ideology. And what that really means within the context of free will is you are looking at reality within the limitations of what you think is possible. And so with that, free will is not a closed world which there is no exit, but it's a limiting situation in which you can transform. And Paulo Freire, a big proponent of Praxis, said, "A necessary but not sufficient condition for liberation is the motivating force for liberating action." And so with that, that leads me into my next conception of praxis, which is necessity. And what that comes down to is what Dr. John was getting at was the ought component of ethics. With necessity, there comes immense amounts of responsibility and obligation for people to act, since there are no banal acts in which there are no consequences. Without praxis, inaction preserves the social institutions which dominate social structure. So in the sense, you're pretty much keeping the status quo, regardless of whether that status quo is ideal or not. And in that sense, you're not pursuing ideals. And if you're not pursuing ideals, you're not making a good life, because the good life, unless you're completely content with that, but if you're content with that, you're still completing actions which go to reify that status quo. And so in that sense, what John Paul Sartre said, you're condemned to be free. And so what that means is, you're existentially obligated to every action that you do or do not do. And so that obligation and responsibility for the fulfillment of good is necessary. So there's obviously bad praxis too. For instance, the Nazis were fulfilling their own praxis. They had values of racism that they were fulfilling through their action. But that is counteracted with the caveat within praxis of ecological literacy. So ecological literacy was rationalized by David Orr, and it's pretty much the understanding principles of, the understanding of principles that organize ecological communities. So pretty much you're looking at how reality works. You're looking at the relationships and the connections within each other. And so with the conclusions drawn from that, you come to a Thich-Nhat-Hanhian interbeing, in which everything is interconnected. The actions of you are consequences for others, and vice versa. There is no autonomous being. So it's a tradition that challenges militarism, authoritarianism, injustice, and ecological degradation. And put well by David Orr. It's a tradition also dedicated to the search for patterns of unity, connections between people of all ages, races, and generations, and between people and the natural world. And so with ecological literacy, it's hard for people to come to that bad conceptualization of like a Nazi praxis. Because in the end, competition goes to undermine each other, and mutual actions make a better world. So in conclusion, those 6 ideas. We have organic intellectual. Everyone's a philosopher. Everything is essentially rational. You can't escape it. You have historicity. You are connected to your past. You are part of the culture in which you were born from. You have hegemony, which is you are part of the present ideological foundations of current culture. You have free will. You have the locus of control. You have agency to choose what you do or do not want to do. You have necessity. You have the responsibility and obligation to fulfill the values that you think are ideal. You have ecological literacy that comes through looking at the connections, relationships between you and others. But in conclusion of the conceptualization of praxis, it wouldn't be a what is praxis intersection without talking about the man who coined it himself, which was Antonio Gramsci. Granted, praxis was around in the Greeks. In Greek, it means doing action, but it didn't come to the ideas of praxis have become much more complicated and complex, interdisciplinary and interdependent with modern philosophy. The Oxford Dictionary says it's free creative thinking and activity as it applies to shaping ethical, social, political, environmental, and economic spheres of life within humanistic lines. And so the essential point of praxis is to surmount the antagonistic contradictions in society. That, I think, is a good definition. But this is the definition by Antonio Gramsci that really puts it very concretely. To work out consciously and critically one's own conception of the world. Now, for that, you've got your organic intellectual, you've got your free will and your necessity to do that. And in connection with the labors of one's own brain, choose the sphere of activity, essentially that's the free will, take an active part in the creation of the history of the world, and be one's own guide, refusing to accept passively and supinely from outside the molding of one's personality. And so, in the end, praxis is not just an abstract philosophical concept. It becomes a process of perpetual recreation. Your actions inform your theory informs your action, and that relationship gets so small that in the end, it's more than just a philosophical concept, it's a way of living.
So approaching this TA project, we came up with this like philosophical framework. We're like, great, we nailed it. Paper. Oh, all right. So where do we go from there? And Dr. John had been talking about incorporating more of a service-based learning thing into his ethics curriculum, and this kind of seemed as the perfect opportunity to do that. And when we were talking about it and kind of getting down to like how is this service learning going to be really different than other service learning projects around campus? Often you'll have kids that have to satisfy a certain number of hours, and they just want to get there, get it done, and be gone. And that's understandable. People have things to do. Sometimes you're not as engaged in the material, whatever it might be. So going back to that original start quote, it says, "Man is condemned to be free. Man is condemned at every moment to invent man." Why does it have to be condemned? Could it rather be empowered? And so what we wanted to do with this Praxis project was basically make an empowerment model where students learning about these philosophical ethical theories can actually put them into practice. And we created a guide with more than, I think, 20 opportunities in and around the valley to do some service learning. And the most interesting thing to see was out of that classroom of students, there was only a handful that actually used that guide that we put a bunch of work into, which is cool. It's still a good resource. But the cool thing to see was that people, once you start going, okay, well, here's the praxis thing, you want to see that theory get, enlivened, they jumped right on it. And there were struggles and there was arguments. It was great. But what we saw come out of this was that critical agency that is kind of the crux of praxis. Within the context of that interdependence. The individual agency is so important for praxis and in our society for people to take hold of what they value and see it come, to fruition in actions, in physical structures, in institutional structures, whatever it might be. And so to see that transformation of, okay, here's a service learning project, here's what I have to get done, it's more of an empowerment model of like, what can I get done? And so it was a strange shift. Ian and I's praxis is traditionally kind of environmentally based, growing food, introducing people to bioregional ways of living, making sure we have clean water out there, just through different recreational techniques of land management, erosion practices. But then we got presented with this, and it almost became praxis within praxis. We were motivating students to get out there and actually try to do what they wanted, and that's what they had to do.
And so, bringing it back home, our story of our independent study, TA-ship, and trying to work with other students and realizing their own values and making them happen, we realized that entire process of philosophizing praxis was praxis itself. That relationship where they're perpetually recreating each other, action and theory, was so enmeshed together that it's really quite hard to see the differentiation between what is not praxis and what is praxis.
And that's a good thing. Absolutely.
And so with that, maybe I'll just finish with reminding you that it's surmounting the antagonistic contradictions in social structures. And when you get into it, it becomes not so necessarily an abstract idea, but it's actually with every action, with every step of being, it is your life.
Pass it on to...
All right. So again, my name is Sam Johnson, and I worked with Gunnison Trails. And I'm just going to kind of share with you the stories of what I went through. I kind of left the theory up to these guys to talk about that. And I first wanted to do this when I saw Gunnison Trails on the board that they presented. They had all these organizations we could work with. And I saw Gunnison Trails, and I was like, oh, perfect, philosophy of mountain biking. How much better could it be? So I was like, oh, sweet. I can do a in-class project while promoting mountain biking and trail use. So what I did for Gunnison Trails is I helped their director Dave Weens put on a event in October. We did a running race, a trail running race, and a mountain biking race. And I think in total we had right around 40 participants. So it was a good turnout for us, especially because it was mid-October. Usually the weather's not so great, but Hartman's was still good. So we had enough time to squeak in one last event. And Gunnison Trails is a nonprofit organization, and what they do is they put on oftentimes small events like that, and that's kind of their fundraising. But what they're really passionate about over there is the trail restoration, building, making sure people are using them, making sure that they're accessible to the people in Gunnison. And really, they want to give back to Gunnison as much as they can, because here in this community, we're very passionate about our trails. We don't like other people on them that aren't from Gunnison. So they're kind of out there to promote that, and I didn't really know that when I first got into it. So that was really cool to find out. And Dave was a great guy to work with. I had looked up to him when I got into mountain biking, and it's like, oh man, it's Dave Weens, man. I get to work next to Dave Weens. How cool is that? And he's a really great guy. He did a lot of work with me, and we've formed a really good relationship. And this has been an ongoing thing for me, because now, after I graduated and after this project, I am now assisting him plan the Growler, which is a much bigger event than what we did back in October. So yeah, it was just a really cool, experience to try to figure out where philosophy met my passion for mountain biking and my passion for trail building and my passion for Hartman's in general. It was a really cool journey through that. And I got into that first by trying to justify my pleasures. I was trying to figure out like how is trail running or mountain biking morally, how does it benefit me morally? I mean, rather than just being really freaking fun. So it was a good way to try to mend that. And when I talked with Dave a lot after the fact, after our event, we both kind of had these interesting ideas of where does that happen and how does philosophy mend with mountain biking or running or motocross or whatever the heck you do out there, whatever you do on the trails. Where does that kind of play into that part, and what does it actually do for us? What are these trails? Why does one a 12-inch line of dirt cutting through the sage, why does that give us such a, a euphoric moment? And why are we so passionate about it? Why do we find it like that's where we can release? That's where we release our stress, and that's where we get away from, all the things that go on in our life. Out there is this like moment of zen, and that's what's so cool about Hartman's and doing events out there and just being out there and doing trail work out there, is because it's kind of this protected area of everyone coming out to just get away from, everyday things in life. And that's why we keep trying to promote it and, restore it and make sure that it's still, that it's not getting destroyed, and that we're using it in a sensible way. And that's what, events like the Growler, now that we have it spanned over 2 days of racing, so we're looking to have 700 participants this year, which is double what we had last year. And I think as of last night, we actually filled up both spots, so we have 700 people planning on coming for the Memorial Day weekend in Gunnison. So that's a huge deal for us. And it's just cool to really see it expand, because that means that we get to use that money and keep doing what we do, love to do, and give back to Gunnison in a really unique, important way. So it was really cool, and it's they're really great people to work with. I've really enjoyed it. And it was a really great experience, and I probably wouldn't have done it if it was mandatory. Because I was being a racer, I was like, I just want to race it. I don't want to, course marshal. Who wants to do that? It's like, I want to ride my bike. I don't want to stand there and watch people do it.
You were condemned to be free.
I was condemned to be free. But now, I've had quite a passion for it, and putting on these events. We have a few coming up in April. And then, of course, the Growler. I don't want to sound like I'm trying to promote the Growler. And then, come out and watch the Growler. But I am looking for volunteers, so if anyone's interested, just thought I'd slide that in there, It's Praxis, you can come. I can teach you the philosophy of mountain biking, I guess. It was just a really great experience, and I'm really, really glad that I did it. Because, like I said, had I not had to have done it, I probably wouldn't have done it. And now it's led me to beyond what I thought I would be capable of doing. So I'm really grateful for that.
Can I also just add, I was joking with Samuel Johnson earlier about coming out of retirement, but his Praxis Project led to a job. This is his job now, and it's a job that reflects his passion in the middle of a recession. So he's really earned it. He would be on the call of duty. I think we need to congratulate him on that.
Thank you. It's volunteer. I'm not getting paid. Don't worry. We're a nonprofit organization. I don't get paid to do what I do.
All right. I'm Lindsay Olander, as Dr. John introduced, and I did my Praxis project with the Justin Healer Crisis Fund, and it is they started out in just doing rodeos. I don't know how much you guys know about the Justin Healers, but they started out only doing rodeos, and now they have branched out, and they're currently doing BMX, motocross, four-wheeling, all sorts of stuff, competitions, and they are on-the-road physical therapists. They'll tape you up so you can ride. They'll set your bones so you can get on the next bull. I mean, they're incredible people. They are, yeah, they save your butt a lot, and they get in there, and it's awesome, and they're a good group of people. They're extreme. They want to be there. They want to help you, and they've helped me. They've helped my friends. I've competed in rodeo. I've never been hurt, thank God. I didn't have to get a bone set, but, they've helped a lot of people that I care about. So to give back to them, not only as a class project, but as a human being, was really awesome. I remember the first day of class, and Dr. John was like, "What is the good life?" And I was like, I really want to say this, but I probably shouldn't. So I looked over to my friend, I was like, "Sex, drugs, and rock and roll." It's got to be it. It's got to be it. Well, then he told us we had to hand it in, and I didn't think that was appropriate to put on paper. So I simply said, the good life is living with no regrets, learning from everything you can. Why be one thing when you can be everything? Simple enough. I guess, and then my statement got torn apart. There's a million questions that go into one sentence. What is regret? Do you need regret as a necessary thing for life? And justice. How do we define justice and what that means to us? Oh, these things tore apart that opinion, and then we had to write a paper on it. And that was just not going to happen. So my project kind of fell into my lap. It was something I was going to do anyways, and someone I care very deeply about. He's my little brother, not biologically, but we're really good friends, and he's a senior in high school at Gunnison High, and they were asked to do a community project too. So he's like, I'm going to put on a rodeo. He rides bulls, and he does bareback as well. He has recently suffered a brain injury from a bull, but he's good. He's fine. But he asked me to do this rodeo with him, and I said, yeah, I'll be there. I'm going to do it. So we got the animals, and we got the people, and the volunteers, and the participants that were going to compete and whatnot, and we had a rodeo. Turns out 17-year-old boy isn't that good at planning things, and it got a little sketch there for a little bit. But he came up to me, and he was like, I can't do this. I need your help. I can't. There's so much going on, and people are looking up to me. I can't do it. It's like, okay, fine. I know how to do this. I know how to do it right. Give me everything. He gave me the tickets. He gave me the money, entry fees, and I took over. And I soon saw that I was the only person doing something. I no longer had a partner in this project, but an audience. And he was learning nothing. He was sitting on the sidelines, and he was not getting anything from this experience. And not only was I like, I was just here to help. I'm not doing all of this. I got Caleb back in it, and I was like, you need to finish this. All these people are here for you because you asked them to be here. And I was like, you got to finish this. You got to get back on. And it's hard and it sucks, but you're here. And these people are counting on you. And you've promised an organization that you would provide them at least a check of some kind. So he, for lack of better words, he really saddled up and he did it. I was really proud of him. He went in a little boy and he came out a man, and he took charge, and he got a lot of criticism for how he performed that day. And to give him credit, he pulled it off. He did it. And I was extremely proud of him in that fact. Through this, I just saw a fight. I saw someone that had a struggle and he needed help, but help can only go so far before it becomes destructive. I mean, you give enough people crutches, they don't have to walk anymore. It's like, if you don't have to walk and you don't have to struggle, then why are you even trying? Another person that gave me this same struggle was Gandhi. So much so that I didn't even... We had a few arguments in class. It was fine. I didn't even finish the required reading for the class because I couldn't understand it. I could not handle where he was coming from. He was weak. He sat there and he let people hurt him physically, steal his food and beat him and just take that. And where I'm from, you kick and you fight and you scream until you can't anymore. And that's important to me. And anything else is just a lack of will. It just means you're not willing to try. It wasn't until my younger sister pointed out that we were the same person, and I had to look in the mirror and realize that even though Gandhi didn't do it the way I would have done it, which is probably not appropriate, but...
The British was still on India.
Yeah, it's fine. I'd have got my point across. Might not have been alive to tell about it, but he stuck it, and he dug his heels in, and he said, you will not control me. You will not control me with food, and you will not control me physically. I am in complete charge of myself and the people following me. And that I respect. I would never let someone take my food. I would never let someone beat me. And that's how I grew up, and that's a personal opinion. But Gandhi and I came to a middle ground, And we found something that you fight, and you never let go of that, and you never stop fighting for something you believe in, no matter how you want to do that. I won't say who is right and who's wrong. I think silence can be condoned at some points, but I also think a fight can be very wrong. I think it's how you approach it. I think it's how you grow up. But I also do believe that a fight is worth it no matter what. So my praxis is complete. I got an A in the class. My philosophical adventure is over. I did
call the registrar.
I did come out of this experience alive, although not unscathed. I was pushed and twisted and contorted in ways that I hope I never, ever have to deal with again, to be honest. Good thing I'm a quick learner and got a memory of steel. For me, praxis, there has to be contentment in this life, a sense of satisfaction in finishing even a small goal. Relishing in a good thing never killed anybody. Perfection will never happen, so stop waiting for it. You might be disappointed. You have a responsibility to yourself above anyone to remain able to will your own existence and form there to be a responsibility, not for the whole world, but a small aspect of it. This is selfish at times, as it should be, but reflection on your amount of taking and your standards of giving should be modified occasionally. Life changes, so must you. Life is also a fight. Fight until you can't anymore, persist, push, persevere. Never give up anything you believe in. Never forget to care enough to let someone fall down and learn how to get back up. So we grow. We go from one point to another, learning from everything that we can, and that is praxis at its finest.
Wow. Those were examples of really specific praxis projects. I don't have anything like that. I didn't understand what they meant by praxis when we started. So for me, the Praxis Project was an exploration. And along the way, I made a lot of different discoveries through more than a few projects, or what I guess you could call projects. I'm still not sure what a praxis project is. But today, I think I'm just going to share one discovery that I made through the process. And I think it's kind of unique, so that's why I chose this one to share. And actually, the reading didn't come out of ethics class. It came out of representation and reality. We did a reading in Derrida. So all of this to say pretty much is that action opened up philosophy for me the same way that philosophy opened up action. And they ended up working well together. So one philosophy that it opened up was Derrida. And Jacques Derrida talks about, he says, there's nothing outside of the text. And I read that, and that's fine. But there was a moment inside of the Praxis Project where I reread that, and it shook me in a new way. When he says there's nothing outside of the text, I took that to mean that everything is text. And he talks about a signification system and how things that signify something else. And so what I thought of was, well, what if that system of signification is akin to our culture? And Derrida also talks about reading exorbitantly. And when you do an exorbitant read of a text, you look for the moments when the signification doesn't match anymore. When you have something that's your signifier, and it's words when you're reading text, doesn't necessarily match what the word was before. And I thought, well, to me, praxis is finding those moments inside of culture. And not only finding those moments, but trying to hold on to them, trying to create them, hold on to them and create them. And so that's very abstract. My example of that is I worked on hosting a Why Occupy Wall Street forum. And that kind of came about because I found a few friends, and they all kind of saw this, what we're going to call it slippage. That's the moment where signification doesn't match anymore, where you had a preconceived notion about what something appeared to be when you were reading it a certain way, and then all of a sudden it felt different to you for some reason. And we all kind of saw that in different ways in the Occupy Wall Street movement. And the example that I use is, in our culture, I believe that we read poverty in a certain way. We view it in light of laziness, and we view it in light of an American dream that says if you work hard, you'll get money and you'll get, you know, the house and all these things. And I think, to me, what the Occupy Wall Street movement represented was a moment at which that signification didn't make sense anymore, because there are so many people who are poor, but they're hardworking, they're ex-vets, there's a lot of things. So I kind of saw that there were these moments of slippage within culture, and I felt that it was an ethical responsibility for everybody who's functioning within inside of that culture to recognize those moments and to try and cling to them and try and make them bigger. And one way to make them bigger is to form the community that I formed with those friends that shared this notion with me. And to me, Praxis became, it is a creation of reality, but it was a creation of that community. And that we had all performed the same read of culture. And it was an exorbitant read, which was ethically responsible. And we had all kind of come to similar conclusions. And out of that, we formed a community. So, you know, somewhere in the middle, and I quote myself, somewhere in the somewhere in the middle, we were required to keep a journal, which I thought was awesome. It was really beneficial for me looking back on what we did. But somewhere in the middle of trying to figure out what Praxis was, because I just signed up for everything. I was like, I'll be the president of this club, I'll be the president of this club, yeah, I'll do a bake sale. I helped out with Sam's event. I just signed up for everything that I could because I thought maybe bells would chime when I felt Praxis, or like, you know, the clouds would part or something would happen, and I'd be like, oh yeah, that's what Praxis is. That never happened. But there were a lot of moments of discovery in the whole process, and one of them was, I wrote in my journal that praxis in the most ideal way alters the person acting. When action engages others and alters the self, it can be called praxis. It's an alteration beyond contemplation. You cannot think this alteration into being, and it cannot be taught, which I think is an important aspect of praxis. And it's an important aspect of reading exorbitantly, because I feel like when we read culture exorbitantly, or when we read text and we're looking for those moments where the signifier slips, I feel like we feel that before we can contemplate it. And that shared feeling resulted in a community for me. And that's kind of my experience. It was a good one. And I appreciated the opportunity, because I think we formed a community as a class, but then I also formed a community with people who were reading culture the same way that I read it. And out of that community, I think we were all somewhat transformed. We became bigger than ourselves. That's all.
Thank you so much to the panelists. I think that it's amazing that 3 months after their final paper, they've come back to revisit these ideas. I think it's extremely generous of them, and that in itself, and creating an intellectual life on the campus, is a form of praxis as well. So really, thank you so much for coming out. You all, when I was listening to you, I was remembering back to our conversations when you were talking about your journals. I was remembering other people's journals, and I remembered I wanted to say two things. One was that the title teaching assistant doesn't quite fit what Brian and Ian did. I said to them, if we're going to do this, if we're going to add this praxis component to my ethics class, which works really well, by the way, right now, you're going to have to lead so much that I don't have to think about it. It'll just happen so smoothly I don't even realize it'll be going on. And that's what they did. And it was really impressive to see that level of student leadership, and then to see their colleagues that were taking the class that open to being challenged by fellow students. And that sometimes is hard. I've been a TA before, and that's a challenge. So thank you to everyone for that. The last thing I would say about Praxis, and then we'll go to questions, is the simplest way I have to think about it is just to use the word realize. And the word realize can have two meanings, right? You can realize something intellectually. You can come to understand something and realize what somebody means by what they're saying, what's written in a text. But you can also realize, if you hyphenate it, realize, in that you make an idea real. You manifest something that was just a concept in someone's head before, and it becomes real in the world. You realize it. And I think that's what we're trying to get at here, is Praxis is bringing together realizing with realizing ideas. And so with that, I think we'll shift to any questions you have for the panel. Or any questions panelists have for each other, or anything. Or Dakota.
Dakota's got a question.
This is being taped.
All right. Do you guys have any advice for myself and the audience on how we may, or insight advice, whatever you want, on how we may find contentment, when, maybe where, how, whatever you want to answer or speak to, in light of the fact that we really like conclusion and stability and like, you know, like I want to be myself tomorrow. I don't want to change, but I know I should. You know, do you have any advice for a situation like mine?
Change.
You can volunteer for the growler. I'll give you my email address afterwards. That'll change.
I think it's important to understand that this is a really hard concept for the Western mind to kind of let go of, is that there is no final conclusion. And thank God there isn't. If you ever got to a point in your life where you're like, cool, that's it, I'm a great person. There's no room for, you know, I guess reacting to the world around us. And I think that is really like kind of the point of the ecological literacy section. Is the ecological literacy, it implies this element of interdependence, of relationships and connectedness, but it also implies that we live in a changing, real physical world. You know, your praxis might be completely different, say, when there's massive water regulations on the state of Colorado, because we've entered our 4th year of intense drought. You know, there's no final end, and there's really no way to quantify how you're going to act in every situation. And so what we tried to kind of poke at with this praxis thing is the habituated character. And, you know, we can kind of repeat ourselves in philosophy a lot, but that concept of arete, of the virtue ethic that Aristotle came up with, is really just being a good person in general, ready to react to, you know, changing environmental conditions, changing social conditions. So in that light, there's no way to try to center on a conclusion person that you want to be. But to have that, I guess, using one of the terms we get, like their organic intellectual awareness of what's going on constantly, to strive to meet that, I guess, element of praxis that you want to get through.
And so with the foundation of ecological literacy, historicity, and hegemony,
And the growler.
and the growler, and the politics club, and Justin Healers, you know, all you have left is to strive for the sake of striving. Your free will, pretty much, is the means of necessity. Your free will is the, you know, it's where you find satisfaction. And your satisfaction is derived from the manifestation of doing your best, meeting the closest thing you can to your ideal. And it's always changing. You know, you're never going to be like, I always want to do this one thing, and it's so high above your reach that you can never do it. Well, you know, maybe it is like that, but, you know, with free will and, you know, it's that closed world. It's not a, you know, it's not a closed world where there is no exit, but it's a limiting situation which you can transform. I think that's once you realize that, that's where it's at.
Easier, like did it start out as like it sounded like it started with a struggle, but not only just mentally but physically. Did it become easier as you finally figured out what was going on?
No. Negative. No. It's hard. I mean, you think about, I'd like to think I'm a good person, and I like to think I do good things on a daily basis, you know? But, I mean, like, there's a line, and it's like, when are you gonna, you know, stop putting a few dollars in the McDonald's thing, you know? It's like, when is it not enough? And how far do you want to push yourself for that? And I don't think anyone can put a value on it, because some people can only put a few dollars in the McDonald's thing, and that's all they can give. And who is to say that that isn't theory in action, you know? And I think little things count just as much as the most effort you can put out.
Lindsay, you talked earlier about your struggle with Gandhi, but what you're saying right now reminds me of your equally frustrating struggle with Plato.
Oh, yeah.
And the tremendous guilt trip he gave you. Sounds like you've come out on the other end pretty balanced after that. Do you want to mention anything about?
Yeah, we started off with Plato, and God, he's hell on everything. You feel terrible after you read that, because you don't work out enough, you don't eat the right things, you don't drink enough, you don't say the right thing. It's hard. And I mean, at the end of the day, like, I tried, because you tell me to do something, I'm going to try my best to do it. So I read Plato, he's like, be perfect. I didn't make it through breakfast, you know? It's just like, it doesn't happen. You can't do it. So I think realizing what you're capable of and the good things that you do have, you can't make that perfect for someone else. You gotta make it perfect for yourself. And if you can't do that, then I think that's an unhappy way to live. You can't provide anything for anybody else if you can't provide for yourself. So, personal opinion.
I have a question about the relationship between the individual and the system in your praxis experience. Because listening to you, it sounds like that first version of Realize, that, oh, I get it, came from individuals, like came from Lindsay's relationship with her non-blood brother, came from the community that Ricky made, came from Dave Weems, and came from individuals. But then when I listened to particularly Ricky talk and then Brian and Ian set things up, you're talking a lot about systematic change and systematic problems. So can you tell me anything that you learned or were left thinking about the relationship between the individual and the system in dealing with praxis?
Well, I've got an example. So, you know, coming from the environmental studies program, my entire life is geared towards, you know, surmounting a carbon society and ultimately ameliorating environmental deterioration. A concept that at times can be so abstract and so defeating that I wish I didn't learn about any of it. But by doing a simple thing like growing a carrot, I go out to my garden, I act like a little rabbit, and I get my carrot out of the garden. And it's a banal act of just feeding myself, but I can realize that I am cutting my carbon footprint by reducing my food miles. I can realize that I am not, what's the word? I'm not making a society dependent on fossil fuels or dependent on processed food, subsidized food from large, farm corporations. So, there's a balance of intellectual and application of the so-called banal, but in the end, it's one and the same.
Yeah, I have a quote here from Paulo Freire. He says, "The pursuit of full humanity, the actualization of a person's ideal, cannot be carried out in isolation or individualism, but only in fellowship and solidarity." So you have those two things, fellowship and solidarity. And so that's unifying as a mass, but I think that requires that individual agency, that critical agency that we kind of talked about earlier. And so really what it comes out of is like, okay, you have the individual actions, you have institutional stuff, and then are you polarizing in between individualism then, grassroots, or are you polarizing towards institutionalism? And what Praxis tries to do is frame it where there is not this false dichotomy. And in a lot of ways, we're seeing this project, we're shaping the individuals who are absolutely going to be part of the institutional picture down the road. And there's kind of a level of faith that, you provide the individuals with the tools they need, that the institutional change will follow. But that Praxis doesn't ask you to make that balance happen. It sees it as more of kind of a, I guess, what would be the best term for that? Hegemonic force, where there is no individual, there is no institution, but there's this weird mosaic of what comes to the surface, of what comes out. And I think, the people who feel better in institutional settings to play out their praxis, that'll kind of develop naturally, and those strong, empowered individuals will take their individual role and base their praxis in that. But you really can't coin one on one side or the other, because then you're just playing semantics. So I think it's important to see the two as separate sometimes, how they connect to one another, and at the end of the day, to not get bogged down in these dichotomies, but to realize that we have effects in both worlds no matter what we do.
Ricky, it seems like your project took on the systematic side of things a little more. Do you want to speak at all to is there a way in which individual community service can sometimes just be about sort of relieving our guilt, and then we don't ask questions about the system? Or you agree with Brian that it is a false dichotomy, they really do come together? The systematic critique with the individual.
Well, I think this individual kind of comes into play in the sense that we all have some agency to recognize ourselves working inside of the system and seeing how it functions and seeing how we operate inside of it. And I think it's false to think that we can assume an exteriority to that. But instead, I think that it's important that we recognize the little systems that we create. For me, the project was about creating the community, and there was something very individual about all of us that connected us to each other. Injustice resonates with me for some reason. Environmental stuff resonates with them. I would never think to grow a carrot. But to me, I believe that discourse is part of praxis, and you can't have discourse by yourself. But you do need, you can, but it doesn't get you very far. To me, the discourse was a way of creating space for me to act. So it took talking to other people. And in doing so, I created this space in the form of community. And I think that if that community could grow, and if we could all have those same kind of similar understandings or same kind of readings of slippage, or what I'm calling it, then that could be a powerful tool to modify the system and create our own reality in so doing.
Nick?
Well, not to get into chicken-egg type thing, but it seems like in order to reflect on action, like action has to first happen. So kind of one of my questions with praxis is, like, how does one become praxical? Like we could, like, not to get Socratic on things, but like if one is not examining their life, do they know maybe to start reflecting on things to act differently? Or is it come from a consequence of acting, let's just say badly, that then makes one want to reflect upon their life? Because often it seems like the reflectors and the actors in our society are sometimes two different things. There's the sages that'll climb mountains and sit for days and days for all the answers, but then if they don't ever come down and share them with the community, what's the point? But then there's some people that'll be like, there's a huge problem, let's clean this up and do this, and they cause 10 more problems. Like they've got the will to act, but they don't have the reflection for it. So my question to you all is like, how can we merge those things? How can we not just like live and examine life and start that there, but how do we merge wisdom and action? Like, how can we start that for the people that aren't in this room? Or like, is it a question that brings it out, or what starts praxis from just living?
You're already condemned to be practicing all the time. It's just a matter of realizing that. What the guys talked about with Sartre, you know, that notion that you're condemned to be free, you're already creating your reality. And for me, I think that what you, it's not one moment. You said something bad could happen, I think.
Well, like if like you're doing something and then, oh, maybe I didn't feed my chickens and they all died. Well, maybe I should reflect upon how I'm taking care of my chickens.
Yeah, but I don't think it happens in one aha moment. You're always acting and you're always reflecting anyway. It's just a matter of deciding the course of that action and reflection, and being aware that you're always already creating your own reality, which is scary. I mean, I wrote about that, and it's scary at first, but then it's also an empowering thing. And I think it's just a matter of realizing that you're creating your reality. You know what Dr. John was saying. And I still haven't heard those bells, you know, from praxis, but I think it happens in little ways all the time. It happens in dialogue. It happens in those little actions that we make every day.
Samuel Johnson, you talked about sort of being forced to do the project at first, and does that help you think about sort of what starts praxis, theory, action?
Yeah, you know, it's kind of this weird, you know, that struggle, that question where you're coming from is like, where do I apply, how do you apply Plato to building trails? Like, how does that work?
The form of a trail.
Yeah, how does it, like, is the trail supposed to be leading me out of the cave? Like, what's, but there is,
That was good.
there is something very philosophical about it, and it kind of has this moment, and what you're talking about, we deal with that a lot with our relationship with the community. You know, like, we may be like, oh, sweet, we're going to have all these people come out for this event, and then there's a lot of people in the community like, we don't want all those people here, because where are we going to go? Where are we going to go ride? Where are we going to go run? Because that's all going to be taken. It's like, well, it's one weekend, but so go ride somewhere else. I mean, this place is amazing. But, you know, we also have to measure, you know, the utility of all of that. And, you know, for us, we have, I don't know if you've heard, a proposed trail to Crested Butte, from Gunnison to Crested Butte. But there's also a proposed trail to have just like that Van Tile area kind of trail is being proposed to be expanded. We would way rather have that because more people are going to use it in the community. And like some people are like, no, you know, we want to ride to Crested Butte. And it's like, yeah, but more people are going to use the other one, and it's easier to make. Like it has a more of a benefit. And that's, you know, there is a kind of like what Mill's utilitarianism. You know, you can measure the utility of your pleasure, and that kind of gives you your moral happiness. So I think that, I don't know if that's...
We see, like, and we talked about this kind of issue. It's like, well, what happens first? You get them to reflect, and then action will inevitably come out, or do they act a whole bunch, and then they get to reflect upon their action? And, you know, there's not really many examples where you can really pin down. It's like, oh, it was doing both at the same time. Awesome. But, you know, if you take sustainable architecture, for example, a big deal with the solar panels on Kelly was that they're offsetting, you know, a carbon footprint. They're producing electricity, somewhat sustainable. That's the heavy metals. But what's their real role when you approach Kelly as an environmental studies major? Are you feeling more empowered? And this is through kind of that critical reflection that I think you're keying in on. To see that, to see their solar panels, you know, up on that building. And when Dr. John, I remember when we first got into the major, he was like, well, I would have a student come into my office in Kelly, and I was, you know, their environmental studies advisor or whatever it might be, but the heating system in Kelly was so inefficient that it was, I had to open my window in the middle of the winter because it was just on, right? That's kind of reverse praxis. You're seeing in action, you're reflecting on it. I mean, it is praxis in a sense, but like, you know, there's action happening, you're simultaneously reflecting, and like all these things are leading towards kind of an end, if you will. And so what we try to do with our own praxis is to not have the chicken and the egg happen, but reflection through action, action through reflection. I think one of the best places to reflect is with a shovel in your hand, quite honestly. And I think a lot of us have those moments or those spaces where you might be performing, and the best actions to take within praxis are mundane. They're banal. They are very simple. You can perform them every day. They're universally accessible, just like we were saying. But through that simplicity of action generated in the right, historicity under a pretense of hegemony, what kind of culture do you have surrounding that, I think praxis can come about simultaneously. And so my best example is, it really is growing food, getting people out there, connected to the land. It could be a sense of place, where all you're doing is walking. You're not actually taking action on anything. But then again, wait, are you? And where do we draw these invisible lines of where, philosophy happens and then, action happens? I don't think it has to be. I don't want it to be as split as it is. And so the whole point is to find that crux for you, because it's not as simple. I gave you 2 examples that were probably the 2 best on the tip of my head, and then I can't really give you much more after that, where it's happening simultaneously. And that is the challenge for all of us in this room, is how do we take these great ideas that we have and these awesome actions that we might have done in the past, but join them, and so that we're acting and philosophizing at the same time. And so
from a teacher's point of view,
it's kind of
I like Lindsay's example a lot, because without the project, she walks away from Gandhi. Without the project reminding her of the power of a fight, she doesn't then have a new lens on Gandhi as fighting, right? And I think that it is hard to separate them. I like the chicken and the egg question. I would go back to what Ricky said about the sort of existentialist view that whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not, we're always defining what humanity is through our actions, through our non-actions, through our choices, through our non-choices. We're always casting a vote, right? The point I made to Brian way back when he first got to college about my window being open before they redid the building was that whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not, in that moment of being in my office, the NVS director is communicating to you that resources are infinite. -30 out, my window's open. Whether I want to communicate that or not, right? If you feel it being communicated or not, that communication is happening. And what it is, it's an expression of values, an expression of meaning. So no matter what's coming out of my mouth as an environmental philosopher in that office, that window's open behind me. I'm communicating resources are infinite. What's that?
Yeah.
Slippage.
Slip, you got it. And that's right. And so what praxis would be about would be coming to consciousness of what we're always already communicating anyway. What values we're living out anyway. Whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not, we are living out and communicating a system of values and meaning. And so praxis is about coming to consciousness of that, and then critically reflecting on whether or not that's what you want to communicate to the world, whether or not that's your vote you want to cast on what has meaning, and then acting on it to create a new meaning if you're not satisfied with it, or perpetuating it if that's the meaning you want to create. You can never escape. Sartre would say there's no escape, no exit was what he called one of his plays. You can never escape the fact that you're creating and communicating meaning, values. So praxis is about just being aware of that and then acting on it, so that you are a autonomous, conscious being with free will, otherwise known as a human, rather than what Thoreau calls living a life of quiet desperation. It's a deliberate relationship with life and reality. But I would actually put action first, given what I just said. I'm going to cast a vote. Go ahead, please.
You mentioned that it's recognizing that the values that you're putting out there.
Right.
And what would you say to someone who has come to that realization about those values, and those values come into direct conflict with yours?
So if you realize you're communicating something that goes against what you consciously believe, like that moment?
No, not necessarily that.
Okay.
I realize that I'm putting out these values, and whether I change it or whether I'm happy with those values,
right.
Someone that's doing the exact same thing, those values that you are working towards or that you are projecting, if those come in conflict. Say, for instance, Ian, who is projecting the values that he places on growing his own food, and someone else has come to the realization that that's worthless and that I am better off eating at McDonald's, say. Like, how do you deal with those?
What a great question. How do you deal with the counter slippage, right? Reactions to your praxis.
I personally think that's an awesome part of life. The other Lindsay that was in our ethics class.
I thought you meant your other personality.
We'll get in that tonight. Another gal in my class, her and I could not be more opposite on everything. Politics, religion, you name it, we should be enemies. I mean, we really should. But me and her, I mean, some of the questions she asked me challenged me so much. I mean, at one point she asked me, who's this God that you always talk about? What is he? And I was like, I don't know. I can't touch him. I can't feel him. And all I can say is I have this faith. And I personally live my life, I'd rather die believing something than die not believing something, you know? And I told her, I was like, I've never seen him before. I've never touched him before. I can't tell you what that is. All I can tell you is I have this faith. I have something there. So it's got to mean a little bit. But Lindsay and I, we could go back and forth. And it was awesome. It wasn't an attack. It was never an argument. And we don't agree on anything. And it's awesome. I mean, she's probably one of my favorite people to talk to. Because some of her ideas, I'm like, wow, I didn't even think of that. Or I didn't even approach it from that direction. And even though I think she's wrong, I appreciate her opinion. You know, I'm like, you're wrong, but thank you for sharing. That's awesome. And she says the same thing right back at me. And it's a good thing, I think. And it's awesome to have different people and different opinions, and we wouldn't have this world without it. I think it'd be boring if we all shared the same stuff.
Yeah. In many ways, you can see that kind of like checks and balances that creates that hegemony. I mean, there is no cultural consensus. There can never be a cultural consensus. That's almost the definition of culture, is that there's all these different consensuses, right? But so when you see, like, well, how do I balance somebody who believes the exact opposite of what I do? Should that deter you in what you do? I think it should challenge you. And like, how do you put it? It's like, you know, if you come into this class with these belief structures, and I'm going to challenge you throughout it, can you put it? If you come out,
well, I often run into people with very different religious views, and you know, I give full, you know, day in court, open-minded, empathetic day in court to Augustine, Aquinas, powerful Christian philosophers. I also give an empathetic day in court to Nietzsche and Sartre, saying God is dead. And I had one class one year that became very concerned about my soul. But I walked into class and on the board it said, Jesus died for Dr. John.
That was another class.
I looked at the class and I said, I don't care what his relationship to eternity is. At least he recognizes the 12 years I put into a PhD. And then there were comments after that on the board every day. And then for a while, the class started getting worried and asked me to stop teaching Nietzsche because they were worried this person was about to do something violent in the class because no one knew who was writing the messages. I eventually figured out who it was, and it turned out to be a very nice, harmless person who, you know, was worried about my soul. But what I ended up saying to the class after that, and to every class beyond that, is whatever truth you bring into this classroom, if it's actually true, it'll still be true after questioning it for 16 weeks. So no fear, no worries in exploring challenges to your value system, challenges to your view of what has meaning. I'd like to hear some of the thoughts, though, on what happens when people unsettle. All the hard work you talk about to bring together theory and action, and finally, oh, you've got this carrot, right? And it reflects a whole worldview, right? And there it is, being the change you wish to see in the world, as our friend Gandhi said. And Suddenly someone completely turns it on its head, unsettles it, and says to you, by the way, 82% of the carbon emissions from food happens before the food travels, so who cares about your food miles? What do you do, right, in those moments of having your praxis challenged after all that hard work of developing it? How do you deal with that?
Well, so going back to the organic intellectual,
I
everyone.
love your carrot. I didn't mean to.
I'll throw you a carrot this time. So everyone's a philosopher, right? And so if everyone's a philosopher, philosophy is the love of wisdom. And in that definition, you're trying to get to wisdom, which is you're trying to get to some higher truth. And you can't just do that by being grounded in beliefs and being firm and unwilling to ever change. You have to, like everybody's saying, question your beliefs. And so it's a dialogue between your own praxis and the rest of the praxis of hegemony. And an interesting and quick example of that, I am actively engaged in trying to communicate my values because I have such urgent necessity that I have to try to ameliorate these environmental problems. And so I walked into McDonald's the other day. And
really?
Yeah, I did. I had some flyers about this organization called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. And real briefly, they're an organization that large corporation CEOs meet with legislatures, and they draft proposals to the Senate. And there's a lot of money exchange, and it's kind of a sketchy organization. I just wanted to talk to people about this organization. What do they think about it? Because if you shop at McDonald's, then your money's going towards this organization that goes towards drafting legislation that in the end favors corporations, and then a lot of the times undermines the small business and undermines the individual. So I go in there with intentions of being dialogical and trying to get to a higher understanding, whether I'm wrong or whether they're wrong. And it was interesting that the store manager kicked me out. The moral of my story is that the necessity of dialogue is always there. That doesn't stop me from wanting to talk to people about what I think is going to make a better world. So,
we have time for one more question. Pete Gauss.
Yeah, the words that you have up there say action upon the world in order to transform it. Yet when we look at historically at the people who've really done that, they've all been killed. The world doesn't want that change. So how do you, as an individual then, deal with that? That if you really want to change the world, you have to be willing to die.
The relationship between courage and praxis.
Yeah. Do you feel that you need to have that courage? Have you had that experience? You came the closest about talking about that, going into a place where there are people who really think differently than you. But when we're confronted with that, do we need to make that choice? Yes, I'm willing to die in order to transform the way other people have. Gandhi, Malcolm X,
Socrates.
Socrates, right at the beginning. Is that what we have to be willing to do?
You put it in these like life or death terms.
I'm afraid to answer.
I like the vegetable terms.
I'll put it like
that's what I'm about.
In kind of a strong retort to that, if I don't enliven my praxis the way I think it should be enlivened, we're all gonna die, man. I don't know how else to say it. And I'm working for justice with my praxis. I'm working for social equity, things that I think are right, and that is way bigger than the individual. That's enormously bigger than the individual. So I think in a lot of ways, focusing on your individual, whether it be mortality or your freedom out of jail, isn't where you should start when you say, okay, I've critically reflected on my values. I'm putting these actions into practice. There's the individual agent there, but the individual agent's personal concerns can't be at the forefront of that. Otherwise, you have a society of nihilism, I think.
I'd like to hear a brief answer from each person. Are there ideas worth dying for? Hard philosophical question, an honest one. Ricky?
Well, I'm going to answer that too, I guess, but when I read that and it says reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it, I read it as a transformation of myself, which I think all praxis is. You can't, I do think there are things worth dying for, but you work up to that. You, I think the transformation that he's referring to here is a transformation of self. And that necessarily happens out of praxis anyway. And you're the only one who exists in your world. We share it, but pretty much you're in your own world. I'm in my own world. I don't know about anybody else.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think if you believe in it, you should be more than willing to die for it. I think if it's not something worth dying for, then not really worth it at all. We're all going to die eventually. I'd rather die for something I believe in.
My answer isn't as extreme, because in this Praxis Project I did have a moment, and I have it now especially, because as I hinted at before, I still am, but I was really focused on racing my bike. I didn't want to help out. And when I was forced to do it, I had this really hard time of being like, because my praxis before was train as hard as I can, and then I'm going to pedal my brains out and hope I win. And now, now it's this moment of just like, that doesn't matter anymore. Because, it's in a sense, it's fulfilling to me, but it's not fulfilling to the people around me. It's more fulfilling for me to go spend hours working on a project, organizing it, and making sure that everyone is okay out there and making sure that everyone has a good time out there. That's way more fulfilling than just my own little bubble being like, oh, cool, I did it in like 4 hours. And it was hard for me, and I still struggle with that because striving to do what I want to do is like, oh, I can't do the growler this year. I'm helping out. I'm organizing it. But in the long term, I'm gaining much more from it. And I believe that once you do that, you step outside. I'm not in myself anymore. I can't, cause, once the events start going, you can't control it. Like sometimes you just have to go with it. You just have to accept the changes and see what happens. And I think that transformation is really important. But I have values that I believe are worth dying for. But yeah, I guess my transformation wasn't that extreme in this project. I guess. Just because, that's what I'm trying to talk about, and I just think trails around this area are very important to me, but I don't believe that they are worth dying for.
They might be worth dying on.
They're worth dying on, and not for.
But death is just one measurement of going beyond self-interest. Mm-hmm. Yours is not as extreme, but you're still talking about stretching beyond self-interest, breaking that bubble, and what's good is not just what's good for me. Just not so far as death. Ian, you get the final word, my friend.
Perfect. So there's things worth dying for. I would first want to make sure I don't answer that question without looking at the other side of the coin. What's worth living for? In my opinion, what's worth living for is to be satisfied, to be content, to be self-actualized. And how am I going to do that? I'm obviously not going to do it through alienated labor and be estranged and work in a factory and be really unhappy and never put my life on the line because I don't have any values. I'm just this little silent dude who just lives his life and he's just a cog in the machine. That's not a good life for me. So there are things worth dying for, and that is the good life, and trying to meet that, trying to realize certain values are worth dying for.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Let's thank the panelists one more time.
really quickly. Everyone, thank you. Just really, really quickly. Remember the 27th for our next intersections. And I just want to say, again, a personal thank you to all of them, and a thank you to Dr. Hausdoerffer. Dr. Hausdoerffer, when he proposed this class to me the first time, I was like, whoa, I don't know, and it was one of those challenges. And I thought to myself, I listened to John's passion for this, and it just rang so true. And watching all of these students and having had almost all of these students in my classes, this is worth living for. This is the kind of thing that as a professor, as a director of philosophy, as someone at Western State College, this is what makes our lives. Yeah. This is what makes our jobs. So I want to thank everybody for being able to share with that tonight. So thank you all for coming.